This building is the U-boat bunker in the French city of Bordeaux. This infrastructure was meant to shelter German submarines from Allied bombing, allowing them to wage war against the convoys crossing the Atlantic. It is not widely known that also the Italian Navy took part in the Battle of the Atlantic with a small force of ocean-going submarines. Their base was located next to this bunker and was known by its code name, Betasom. In this video I'm going to tell you the story of Betasom and of the submarines deployed there during World War II. At the start of World War II, Italy had one of the largest submarine fleets in the world, divided into 38 oceanic and 68 coastal submarines, plus some other units serving for different purposes. The distinction between the two main types laid essentially in the size, range and number of guns. Italian pre-war plans imagined a conflict fought against France, where the coastal submarines would have saturated the Mediterranean and the oceanic ones would have crossed the Strait of Gibraltar to attack French merchant routes. For this purpose, the Italians conducted deep oceanographic studies about this particular strait and its streams. During wartime, this knowledge proved to be a great advantage and not a single submarine was lost in crossing the strait. The deployment of Italian submarines in the Atlantic began in June 1940, with two submarines departing from their bases a few days before the official declaration of war, while other two followed in July. One of them aborted the mission due to a series of inconveniences, while the other three, Finzi, Calvi and Veniero, reached their ambush zones west of the Canarian Islands, but sighted no enemy ships. The three then returned to Italy, crossing again undetected the Strait of Gibraltar. This brief experience immediately underlined the difficulties of operating submarines in the Atlantic from bases in Italy. In July, the Regia Marina proposed to the Kriegsmarine to deploy a force of around 30 submarines in one of the bases located in occupied France, an option that would have facilitated the conduct of offensive operations. Admiral Dönitz, who at the time could not rely on a large number of submarines, warmly accepted the proposal, and thus began the story of the Betasom base. After receiving the approval from the Kriegsmarine, Admiral Angelo Parona departed for France, in search of a suitable location that could host the new Italian base. Admiral Parona, in agreement with Marico Somma, the submarine command, selected the port of Bordeaux, and consequently the Regia Marina issued a directive on the 23rd of August 1940 establishing the Gruppo Sommergibili Atlantici, or Atlantic Submarines Group, with Admiral Parona in command. 27 submarines were initially assigned to the new base, codenamed Betasom, 10 of the Marcello class, 6 of the Marconi class, 3 of the Calvi and Liuzzi classes, 2 of the Otaria and Argo classes, and 1 of the Breen class. These units started to arrive in Bordeaux from September 1940, in small groups, and although being dependent from the Regia Marina High Command in Italy, they received operational directives from the Kriegsmarine U-boat Command. The base was centered around a basin with the main entrance on the river Garonne. There were two dry docks, command and logistical buildings, while crews and personnel were housed in two liners, the Grasse and Usaramo, moored nearby. The surveillance was granted by 225 Marines of the San Marco Regiment. On the western end side there was another basin where the Germans will build their U-boat bunker from mid-1941. In the first period of operation, from September to December 1940, the Betasom submarines managed to sink 18 ships, totaling 69,000 tons of shipping, for the cost of 2 submarines lost. One of these sinkings was the Belgian merchant Capalo, torpedoed by the submarine Cappellini, commanded by Salvatore Todaro. Todaro decided to tow a lifeboat with 26 survivors from the Capalo, and later took them on board, given deteriorating sea conditions. They were disembarked and set free on the Azores a few days after. After his return, Todorow's behavior was criticized by his superiors and by the Germans, since he ran unnecessary risks, but hopefully a natural sense of humanity had strongly prevailed in Todorow's mind. In this period, the Italian submarines operated mostly in the central eastern Atlantic, but some of them also went hunting in the North Atlantic. Overall, their performance was not exceptional if compared to the German U-boats. Anyway, those first months of Atlantic experience brought to the surface several problems inherent to the Italian submarine warfare. The submarines took too much time to submerge, from 60 to 120 seconds versus the 30-35 seconds needed by the German subs. Their speed on surface was often not sufficient to pursue enemy targets. Their large conning towers facilitated the sighting from enemy vessels and aircraft. Commanders and crew had no real training in convoy hunting operations in oceanic environment. There were no computing machines to fire torpedoes, thus complicating operations at night. Ultimately, seaworthiness was challenged by the rough conditions of the North Atlantic. The origin of such problems laid in the Great War experience of the Italians in the Adriatic Sea, which was completely different from that of the Germans. In such conflict, the Regia Marina deployed lonely submarines in specific choke points or routes where the crew had to wait their targets submerged, with no actual search and chase of their prey. In the course of World War II, several modifications and upgrades were implemented on Italian submarines that partially improved the situation. The most obvious and recognizable being the rework of the conning towers. Towards the end of the year, Admiral Parona demanded to have some of his men trained by the German in the submarine school of Gotenhafen. Following the approval of both navies' high commands, training started in April 1941, with the submarine Giuliani relocating in the Baltic German base. In the early months of 1941, part of the offensive efforts were directed to the North Atlantic, while the rest to the Central Atlantic area of operations, more suited for the Betasom submarines. In May, there was the first offensive operation west of Gibraltar. 7 submarines were deployed and sank 6 merchant ships. At the end of May, the submarines Guglielmotti, Archimede, Ferraris and Perla arrived in Betasom. These were the units who had left the Italian East Africa and circumvented the African continent after a long and perilous voyage. 2 of them remained in Betasom until their eventual sinking, while Perla and Guglielmotti returned to the Mediterranean. Between May and June, the Germans concluded that it was better to withdraw the Italians from Betasom. This was for a series of reasons: their low performances, the need to find new bases and space for the increasing numbers of U-boats, and thirdly, because more naval reinforcements were needed in the Mediterranean. Hitler personally communicated the decision to Mussolini, and on the 8th of June, the Italian Chief of General Staff ordered the Regia Marina to withdraw all the Atlantic submarines from Betasom. The Regia Marina was not happy with this, nor was Admiral Parona. He managed to convince Admiral Dönitz to maintain Betasom and leave the larger submarines, who were not suitable for operations in the Mediterranean. As a consequence of that, several submarines began their withdrawal to the Mediterranean. The number of units available in Betasom thus decreased from 27 available in June to 18 available in September and 11 available in December. These figures also include the losses. After that, the deteriorating relations between Parona and Marecosom led to his replacement with Commander Romolo Polacchini already in September 1941. In November, the existence of Betasom was put in question once more, this time by the Italians. Marshal Cavallero, Chief of General Staff, wanted to withdraw all the Atlantic submarines and use them for transport duties between Italy and Libya. When the decision took shape in December, the Germans intervened and stopped the dismantling of Betasom. The strategic picture had changed, and with the US entering the war, the Kriegsmarine wanted to use all the available submarine forces. The balance of 1941 was 33 ships sunk, totaling 160,254 tons, at the high cost of 8 submarines lost. In January 1942, the Betasom Command sent all the available submarines, Tazzoli, Da Vinci, Finzi, Torelli and Morosini, to hunt down Allied traffic in the area between Florida and the Bahamas. The mission lasted until April, and the Italians managed to sink 16 ships, with the Tazzoli sinking 6 of them alone. It was then the turn of the submarine Calvi, that left for a 52-days-long operation in Brazilian waters, where she sunk 5 ships, totaling 29,000 tons. The summer saw the few remaining submarines sinking 6 more ships, with the loss of the Morosini and Calvi, while the Torelli was severely damaged. In October, only the Tazzoli and Da Vinci were available for new offensive operations, and managed to sink 4 large merchant ships, totaling 46,000 tons of gross tonnage. These 2 submarines were commanded by Carlo Feccia di Cossato and Gianfranco Gazzana Priaroggia, who became the top submarine aces of the Regia Marina. In October 1942, the large oceanic submarine Ammiraglio Cagni was destined to operate in the Atlantic, reinforcing the depleted ranks of Betasom and bringing up the number of available submarines to 10. The Cagni crossed unharmed the Strait of Gibraltar and later sunk the British armed merchant Da Comba. The Cagni cruised along the African coast, reaching the waters off the Cape of Good Hope, where she sank the Greek steamer Argo. The submarine went back, arriving in Betasom at the end of February, after 136 days of mission, establishing the absolute record of permanence at sea among Italian submarines in World War II. At the end of the year, Captain Enzo Grossi, former commander of the submarine Barbarigo, became the commanding officer of Betasom. Grossi was a decorated but quite discussed figure, since his fame came from the claimed sinking of 2 American battleships off South American coasts. The former commander, Admiral Polacchini, was quite skeptical about these sinkings, but the propaganda machine opted to exploit such claims, which ultimately proved to be false. At the beginning of 1943, Betasom could rely only on the submarines Tazzoli, Archimede, Bagnolini, Barbarigo, Cappellini, Torelli, Finzi, Da Vinci, plus the Cagni still at sea. These units departed for the last cycle of offensive operations along the Brazilian and African coasts. The Archimede was lost at the end of February, while the Leonardo da Vinci was sunk in May. This submarine was on a return voyage from a successful mission that even touched the Indian Ocean, where she had sunk 6 merchant ships, making it the most successful Italian submarine of World War II, scoring 120,000 tons of shipping sunk. Commander Gazzana Priaroggia died with the entire crew in the sinking. By this time, the Italian Atlantic submarines, already few in numbers, were rapidly becoming obsolete, and thus the Germans saw the opportunity to use them in the import of strategic materials from the Japanese-controlled East Indies. The wider internal spaces could grant the transport of bigger cargoes compared to those of the U-boats. The Italians accepted to concede these units in exchange of a same number of Type 7 U-boats. The Betasom submarines underwent the necessary modification works, which included the disembarkment of all weapons and ammunition to make extra room, with the exception of AA guns. Between May and June, the submarines Cappellini, Torelli, Tazzoli and Barbarigo departed for their long and distant missions to the Far East. Only the first 2 arrived at their destination, but ultimately never came back to Europe. Also, the modern submarine Cagni was committed to the transport missions. The larger size of the unit allowed the Cagni to retain the armament so that she could still attack enemy merchants on the way. The submarine departed in June, making route for the South Atlantic and later the Indian Ocean. On the 8th of September, the submarine was only 1,800 miles from Singapore, when she received the news of the armistice signed between Italy and the Allies. New orders from Rome prescribed to proceed to the Allied port of Durban, where she arrived on the 20th of September. Right after the armistice, the Germans seized the last two remaining subs, Bagnasco and Finzi. Most of the men still in Betasom chose to stay loyal to the Germans, the alternative being prison camps or slave labor, and were later repatriated to northern Italy, where Hitler had installed a puppet government chaired by a depressed and ill Mussolini. Giacomo Parodo, a marine of the San Marco regiment, escaped and tried to reach out the French resistance. He was later captured by the Germans, and upon refusing to collaborate, he was executed. With those happenings, the story of the Betasom base comes to an end. To draw some conclusions on the Italian participation to the Battle of the Atlantic, 31 submarines effectively operated from Betasom in the 36 months of operations. Overall, they sank 109 merchant ships, totaling 568,000 gross tons. 16 submarines and 760 men were lost in the fight. The Italian crews fought in a harsh environment, for which they had received no training nor possessed the adequate doctrine. They progressively gained valuable experience and improved their performances, finding their most suitable environment in the Central and South Atlantic areas of operations, waging war very far from their base. A quite forgotten page of history which I think deserves to be told. I hope you have found this video interesting, and as always, sources are in the description. Remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you wish. Good luck and fair seas!